He signed the order on a Tuesday morning. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just reached across the mahogany desk, dragged his pen across the bottom of the page, and slid it back like it was a parking ticket. 31 years of Mikhail Ostrovsky's life, gone in one signature. And the man taking it from him still hadn't learned how to say his name. I was there. I watched it happen, and I didn't say a word. That part usually throws people. They expect me to say I argued, that I cried, threatened him, filed something, did something loud, something reasonable. But by then, I'd already made up my mind. Reasonable is how you lose when the other person has already decided you're not real. And I had no intention of losing. The Alderton Municipal Conservatory sat on 11 acres in the oldest part of the city. It had been there since 1924, when a private family deeded the land to the public under terms that made sense at the time and were mostly forgotten not long after. The main greenhouse was original Victorian cast iron, not a replica, not a restoration, the real thing. Original glass, original frame, even the moss in the seams between the panels was old enough that nobody had the heart to scrub it off. On winter mornings, when the light came in low, the place felt warm, quiet, and a little outside time. Not romantic, not magical, just old in a way most buildings never get to be. You could hear water moving through pipes behind the walls, glass ticking as the temperature shifted, somebody's cartwheel catching in the same uneven strip of tile it had caught on for 20 years. I'd worked there for 11 years as head botanist. That's a title that sounds better than the job. At a mid-sized municipal conservatory, head botanist means you're also the archivist, the grant writer, the person fixing humidity calibration at 2 in the morning, and the unofficial grief counselor for a staff of 9 people who had given this building something like 230 years of their lives between them. Mikhail had been there the longest, 31 years. He knew every plant by name, and I mean that literally. He had names for them the way some people name cars. He was 72, and he moved through the tropical wing like he owned the place. In a way, he did. That building was the closest thing he had to a home. Everybody who worked there knew it. Nobody said it out loud, because some things don't need the ceremony. The others were the same kind of story. Elena was 68 and had kept the orchid collection alive through 3 budget freezes and a roof collapse. Bernard was 74, showed up every morning at 6:15, no matter the weather, and didn't own an alarm clock. Younger staff came and went over the years. The old ones stayed. They were part of the building the same way roots are part of a tree. The younger hires learned from them whether management recognized it or not. Nobody had ever put that in a handbook. Nobody needed to. It lived in repetition. In gestures. In the way doors were opened, hoses were coiled, labels were checked, and silence was used. There were routines in that place that lived somewhere between policy and superstition, which is where institutions keep the habits that actually matter. Mikhail opened the tropical vents in an exact order no manual had ever written down, because, according to him, the old hinges settled better if you treated them with respect. Elena checked orchid leaves with the back of her knuckle before she looked at them. Bernard walked the perimeter before sunrise and kicked leaves clear of the drainage grates with the side of his boot. Nobody assigned any of that. Nobody monitored it. It was just what happens when people pay attention longer than the institution itself remembers how. Places like that don't survive on mission statements. They survive on repetition. On somebody knowing the west latch sticks when the weather turns damp. On somebody hearing a pump go wrong before the gauge does. On somebody carrying coffee down a dark hallway at 6 in the morning and hitting, without looking, the exact switch that keeps frost off a root system imported before the Second World War. Vane saw payroll. I saw the mechanism that kept the place alive. Those are not the same thing. Mikhail's plant names were never cute. A palm with a split frond was called Pavel because it leaned the way his brother leaned after a roofing accident in 1983. An old cycad near the south wall was called Judge because, in Mikhail's opinion, it looked like a man who had ruined 3 weddings. That was the scale of what Vane thought he was cutting. Not wages, not headcount, a whole pattern of memory spread across 9 old bodies and one building too old to defend itself in language men like him respected. That was the world I walked into every morning. That was what was on the line. There were routines in that place that lived somewhere between policy and superstition, which is where old institutions keep the habits that actually matter. Mikhail opened the tropical vents in an exact order no manual had ever bothered to write down because, according to him, the hinges settled better if you treated them with respect. Elena checked orchid leaves with the back of her knuckle before she looked at them. Bernard walked the perimeter before sunrise and kicked leaves clear of the drainage grates with the side of his boot. Nobody assigned any of that. Nobody tracked it on a spreadsheet. It was just what happens when people pay attention longer than the institution itself remembers how. Younger hires learned by standing near them, watching, and not talking too much. That's how knowledge moved there, quietly, hand to hand, habit to habit. He showed up on a Wednesday in early November. His name was Curtis Vane, and if I described him too carefully, you'd think I was making him up, so I'll stay exact instead of dramatic. Mid-50s, dressed well in the way men dress when they've recently decided money and taste are the same thing. A face that had almost never been told no and had never built the patience that usually comes from hearing it. He walked into the conservatory the way people walk into a parking garage they're thinking about buying. Measuring, dismissing, already mentally somewhere else. He had gotten the conservatory through the kind of deal that doesn't need a long explanation because it was exactly what it looked like. A city low on money, a developer with connections, a process that moved faster than public comment was designed to stop. Technically, the building had not been sold. That was the official word choice. It had been transferred to private stewardship under a revitalization mandate, which meant the city handed Curtis Vane 11 acres of prime urban land in exchange for a promise to invest in the community, a phrase that has never meant what it sounds like. I found out the same way everybody else did, a press release. Friday afternoon, right before a long weekend. He toured the greenhouse with two men in coats who were apparently architects, and he spoke to them the whole time like the rest of us were furniture. He pointed at the Victorian ironwork and said something about remediation costs. He pointed at the orchid section and called it, and I'll quote this exactly, all this. 30 years of Elena's work reduced to a hand gesture. Then he stopped near the old fig tree in the center atrium. That tree is more than 100 years old. It holds the room together. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, the only time on the whole tour he stopped moving, and said, "That'll have to come out." Not, "Can it come out?" Not, "What's the history there?" Just, "That'll have to come out." Like he was noting a delivery schedule. I wrote it down. I write most things down. It's an occupational habit, and it had never been more useful than it was over the next few weeks. What happened with Mikhail was the following Friday. Vane came in around mid-morning, carrying coffee from the expensive place across the street, the kind of cup people hold like it's a personality trait. He had 2 cups. He handed both of them to Mikhail, who happened to be closest to the entrance, and without even looking at him said, "Hold these while we get set up." So Mikhail held them. Then Vane glanced back and really noticed him for the first time. The hands, the posture, the age, and he said, loud enough for the room, "How old are you? 70? And you're still doing this? What do they pay you, $10 an hour?" He said it smiling. That's the part that stayed with me. He smiled because he thought it was funny. He thought the distance between his life and Mikhail's life was a joke he was entitled to tell. Mikhail didn't answer. He just stood there holding 2 cups of coffee for a man who didn't know his name and looked down at the floor. Something in his face shut very quietly, like a door closing slow so it doesn't wake anybody up. I watched it happen. I wrote it down. 3 days later, Vane called a staff meeting in the main atrium, under our fig tree, and announced the closure. The building would be shut to the public in 30 days. All current staff were being terminated effective the closure date. No severance. The reason on the paperwork was operational discontinuation, which is the kind of phrase designed to make the destruction of somebody's livelihood sound administrative. He stood in front of 9 people whose combined institutional memory went back further than his driver's license and told them their years didn't count. He even managed to do it in a tone that suggested the real inconvenience was that they weren't grateful for the clarity. The room reacted the way rooms react. Some people went still. Some got wet-eyed. Bernard, 74 years old and never laid a day in his life, pressed his lips together and stared out past everybody with the look of a man being told the thing he built his life around had apparently never mattered. Vane was already checking his phone. Nobody begged him to reconsider. That's one detail people always expect when I tell this part, and it matters that it didn't happen. These were old workers. Old workers understand humiliation better than most young ones because they've seen more versions of it. They know when a man has already decided what kind of room he's in. Elena didn't cry in front of him. Bernard didn't raise his voice. Mikhail didn't say a word. They stood there and took the blow standing up. That made what he was doing uglier, not cleaner. There was no chaos to hide behind, just a man with money erasing people in plain language under a tree older than he was. Before anybody else could speak, I asked the staff to wait. Calmly, I said, "Please don't sign anything yet. Let me review the terms. Let me make sure we understand what we're looking at before anybody puts a name on paper." Vane glanced up and smiled at me with that cheap version of contempt people use when they think you're too small to deserve the real thing. He told me to take my time. He said it the way you say it to a child finishing a drawing before leaving the table, like the outcome was so locked that indulging the delay cost him nothing. He was right that the outcome was certain. He was just wrong about which one. That night, I went home and made a list. Not of grievances, not of feelings, just every document I'd ever seen pass through the conservatory archive that I had never fully read. Near the top was something I had cataloged years earlier and barely thought about since. A 1924 deed of conveyance with attached covenants. I had held it once, 8 years before. I filed it, went home, and forgot about it until the moment Mikhail stood in our atrium holding a stranger's coffee cups. That was when I started thinking about it again. The municipal archive closed at 9. I stayed until 8:53, which is as long as they let anybody stay, and the woman at the desk had started putting on her coat at 8:45 as a hint I ignored. The file I needed was in a sub-basement storage room that required a key, a request form, and enough patience to let somebody disappear and find it. That took 22 minutes. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, wrote notes on a legal pad, and thought about nothing except the task in front of me. The place was so quiet you could hear shelving settle somewhere behind the wall. Every so often, a cart rolled past at the far end of the hall, and then the sound would disappear again. That's how I work. It always has been. You clear the rest out and look at what's actually there. Most people can't do that. They get scared or angry, fill the whole room in their head with fear and anger, then wonder why they can't think. I've never found that useful. Feelings are information. You record them, you file them, then you get back to work. What I felt in that chair was a cold, exact kind of fury. I'll note that for the record. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because calm was the most dangerous thing I could be. The heating was the next move. I almost saw it coming. Vane cut the HVAC allocation for the greenhouse wings by 60% starting the second week of November. The stated reason, in a memo that landed in my inbox on Tuesday morning, was budget realignment pending transfer of facility operations. In real terms, that meant the tropical wing, which needed a steady minimum of 68 degrees, was going to get something closer to 52. And 52 degrees will do exactly what you think it does to a tropical collection. He knew that. The memo wasn't a mistake. It was a message written in thermostat settings for people who couldn't afford lawyers. Elena came to my office with the memo in her hand and a look on her face I had never seen before and hope I never see again. She had spent 30 years keeping those orchids alive through every indignity the place had suffered, and now she was being told to watch them die by paperwork. She stood in my doorway and said, very quietly, "What do we do?" It didn't even sound like a question, more like a sentence wearing the shape of one. She already knew where all the normal answers ended. File a complaint, call the union, talk to facilities. All roads led to a legal team with more money than our entire operating budget and all the time in the world. I told her what I told the others. Hold on, don't sign anything. Give me a little more time. For the next few days, the tropical wing felt like a hostage situation with ferns. Staff started bringing in space heaters from home, even though we all knew facilities would notice if too many plugs lit up the same circuit. Elena moved the most fragile orchids in tight clusters so the surviving heat would hold around them longer. I stayed late, recalibrating humidifiers that were never meant to compensate for deliberate neglect. Every hour the building gave up a little more warmth. Every hour Vane saved a little more money. That's the thing about administrative cruelty. It almost always arrives dressed as efficiency. A memo, a percentage cut, a revised facility schedule. Then suddenly, you are standing in front of a living collection older than you are, trying to decide which part gets a chance and which part gets written off. She looked at me for a second, nodded, and went back to the tropical wing. I watched her leave, turned back to my desk, opened the photo I'd taken of the 1924 document, and kept reading. Vane came back that Thursday. By then, he had started dropping in without notice, which I understood perfectly. Unannounced arrival is a dominance move. It's the corporate version of not knocking. He walked through the main greenhouse with one of his architects and spoke loud enough to suggest the building was already empty. He stopped outside my office. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway, the way people stand when they've decided a room doesn't deserve their shoes, and looked at the stacks on my desk, the ledgers, the archive boxes I'd borrowed, all of it, and said, "Still in here reading?" I said yes. He said, "You know what you remind me of? One of those, what do you call them, overgrown librarians. Like the building's been empty for years and nobody told you." He said it pleasantly. That's what mattered. Same tone somebody might use to compliment a sweater. It wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. His contempt was comfortable enough not to bother dressing up. He had fully decided I wasn't a person who required serious consideration. I was just part of the old room. I looked at him and said, "I appreciate the observation." He laughed and walked away. I wrote it down. Men like him make the same mistake over and over. They think quiet is surrender because they only understand noise as resistance. If you don't flinch, shout, threaten, or try to perform outrage for them, they assume you've accepted the hierarchy they brought into the room. Vane had already put me in the category of people who take notes and lose. He thought the notebook was evidence of helplessness. He never considered it might be the beginning of a record. What he didn't know, and had no reason to know because it had never crossed his mind that I might be doing anything but delaying the inevitable, was that by then I had already found what I needed. The 1924 Alderton deed was 11 pages of dense legal language in a typeface that made me lean forward to read it. It had been sitting in sub-basement file room C for close to a century in a cardboard folder with a water stain on the cover that had probably dried sometime during the Eisenhower years. It had been referenced in exactly 2 later city documents, both administrative summaries from the 1940s. After that, nothing. The legal department had turned over twice since anyone last touched the original. The building's memory of the document had just faded out, the way institutional memory always does when everyone assumes somebody else must know. I needed to know. Section 7, paragraph C, 14 lines of 1924 legal language that translated into something very simple. The land stayed privately transferable only as long as 2 conditions remained true. 1. The facility had to stay open to the public without restriction or fee. 2. It had to be maintained by city-contracted custodial and horticultural staff. If either condition failed under any title holder, the land reverted automatically to the city of Alderton in fee simple absolute, voiding every transfer that came before it. Automatic reversion. No court needed, no petition, no injunction. No long, slow litigation while the building got stripped anyway. Close the doors or fire the staff, and the $25 million transaction unwinds on its own by operation of law. The land just goes back. I sat in that archive room for a while after I finished reading. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somebody dropped a ring of keys in the hallway and the sound carried. Then I took out my phone, photographed every page, went home, and slept better than I had in 3 weeks. The archive smelled the way every municipal archive eventually smells. Dust, cardboard, old glue, that faint, cold medical air conditioning they use to preserve paper instead of people. Even the light felt administrative. Nothing in there invited emotion, which, for my purposes, was perfect. The first good sign was in the cross-references. Thin, administrative summaries from the 1940s, typed on onion skin copies so fragile they felt like they might bruise. Neither one quoted the clause in full. Both only mentioned it indirectly, which told me the city had once known exactly what it had, and then, through normal bureaucratic decay, stopped knowing. One memo referred to public use and staffing continuity covenants. Another warned that interruption of public access or non-city staffing could disturb title. Disturb title. That phrase stayed with me. It sounded like old law speaking in a low voice. Not panicked, not decorative, just certain. The kind of certainty institutions used to write down before everybody started pretending ambiguity was sophistication. I requested everything tied to that file number. Most of it was useless in the obvious way. Insurance correspondence, boiler inspections, a 1968 argument over sidewalk repairs. But useless paper still tells you who touched what and when. Bureaucracy leaves tracks. A routing slip, initials in one corner, a filing stamp that matches another folder 20 years later. By 8:30, I knew enough to be sure the deed had never been replaced, never neutralized, never seriously re-examined. It hadn't been defeated, it had just been buried under newer paper, the way a bone disappears under dirt. That happens all the time in cities. Nobody has to destroy the thing, they just have to outstack it. Enough new folders, enough renamed departments, enough people retiring at the right time, and a live mechanism turns into background texture. Ruth at the desk brought me the original folder with the expression of somebody delivering information she had no intention of discussing. 11 pages, water stain on the cover, city stamp half faded. The attached covenants were on heavier paper than the rest, like the lawyer who drafted them wanted the warning to outlive the transaction. I read the whole thing once without taking notes, because first I needed to know what it was, not just what it said. Then I read it again with my notebook open. Then I read Section 7 3 times in a row until the antique language turned into mechanism. Public access without restriction or fee, maintained by city-contracted custodial and horticultural staff. Failure by any party holding title. Automatic reversion. Fee simple absolute. Sometimes your body understands something before your mind finishes catching up. Not excitement. Excitement is messy. This was cleaner than that, narrower, like feeling a lock move 0.5 millimeter and knowing the rest is just technique. I photographed every page twice. I copied the clause out longhand even though the photos were clear. Writing it in your own hand makes your mind respect it. It slows the thought down just enough to keep you from getting theatrical about it. I need to tell you about Bernard before I tell you what came next, because Bernard is why I did it the way I did. He was sitting in the break room when I got back that evening, still in work clothes, eating a sandwich out of a paper bag. The radio in the corner was off. The vending machine hummed. Somebody had left a half-dead poinsettia on top of the fridge from the previous winter, and nobody had thrown it away. It was 6:30. His shift had ended at 4. He had nowhere else he wanted to be, and he knew it. So he stayed in a building that technically already had one foot in the grave because home felt less like home than that room did. He sat there, eating his sandwich and looking out at the street. He didn't even notice me in the doorway. That's the image I kept. Not Vane signing papers, not the council chamber, not the locks getting cut off the gates. Bernard at 6:30, eating a sandwich in a building that had never been his on paper and somehow still was. Standing there, I decided what I was about to do was not going to be clean or detached. It was going to be precise. Those aren't the same thing. I hired a municipal attorney named Harold Greaves. He was 79, had practiced in the city for 51 years, and had the kind of face that had stopped being impressed sometime around 1987. I found him through an old zoning dispute in the archive. His name was in a 1989 document as a consultant on historical land covenants, which told me he was exactly the kind of specialist I needed. I called his office. His assistant sounded mildly surprised anybody still did. We met Friday afternoon in a downtown building that had not been renovated since Ford was president. Harold's office sat at the end of a hallway lined floor to ceiling with bound volumes of municipal code, all labeled by year in hand-lettered ink from 1951 through 2019. The carpet had the flattened look of a place where generations of clients had come in angry and left poorer. There was no receptionist desk out front trying to perform success, just a hallway, old books, and a man who had outlived several waves of legal fashion. That told me everything I needed to know about how long he'd been at it and how little patience he had for reinventing systems that already worked. He sat behind a desk the size of a dining table and read the document without saying a word. He read it slowly, turned it over, read it again. Then he set it down, looked at me over his glasses and said, "Does the developer know this exists?" I said I didn't think so. He said, "Does anyone at the city know this exists?" I said I doubted it. He sat quiet for a second. Then he said, "If he closes the doors to the public or terminates the city staff before this gets litigated, he loses the property by statute. No cure period, no notice requirement. The reversion executes itself." I said I understood. He said, "What exactly are you planning?" I said I was planning to help him close the doors. Harold looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he'd need a certified copy of the deed and a notarized affidavit establishing chain of custody from the archive. I told him I'd have both by Monday. He said that would be fine, in the tone of a man who had been saying things were fine for 50 years and usually turned out to be right. I shook his hand and left. I had maybe 17 days before Vane's scheduled closure. Meanwhile, and this is the part that still tightens the back of my jaw when I think about it, Curtis Vane was having an excellent week. He held a presentation for his investors on the 12th floor of a glass tower downtown. I know what happened in that room because one of the investors later described it in deposition. There was a scale rendering on a 12-foot screen, material samples laid across a long table, imported travertine for the lobby, hand-milled walnut for the bar, custom glass panels for the facade being sourced from Belgium. The whole plan was for a private members club built mostly to tell you, through architecture, that you were not invited. Vane told the room the acquisition had gone cleaner than expected. He described the existing staff as a transition challenge that had largely resolved itself. He described the conservatory as underutilized heritage infrastructure, which is what people say when they mean something old that ordinary people love is taking up space where money wants to sit. He wasn't wrong that the acquisition had been clean. He was wrong about what it had actually acquired him. Money makes people careless that way. Once the wire clears and the press language goes out, they start talking like possession and control are the same thing. What got to me was not that he wanted the land. Men like him always want the land. It was how quickly he started talking as if the people inside the building had already become a clerical inconvenience. In that investor room, he wasn't talking about 9 workers with names and histories. He was talking about friction, delay, transition burden. He had reduced decades of labor to a nuisance line between acquisition and profit. That's the kind of thinking that makes men feel efficient when they're really just morally lazy. Once he had labeled the people as overhead, the rest of it became easy for him. Heat cuts, termination orders, locked gates. Same hand, same pen, same empty smile. The meeting with Vane happened Monday morning. His office was exactly what you'd expect. Glass, steel, minimalism so expensive it had to announce itself quietly. I wore my work clothes. I carried my usual notebook. I sat across from him at the mahogany desk, took out the conservatory keys, and placed them between us. 1 ring, 4 keys. Small laminated tag. Alderton Conservatory. Authorized staff. He looked at the keys, then at me. I told him I'd been thinking. told him I understood now that the building's future was settled, that I'd reviewed the documents carefully, and I couldn't see a legal path that changed the outcome. I said dragging this out was only making things harder on the staff, and they deserved clarity. I said I wanted to help make the process efficient. I could draft the termination paperwork for each employee. I could have everything ready by the end of the week. I said all of it in the same tone I would use to report humidity readings. Even, clear, slightly tired. He watched me with the expression of a man who had just seen his opponent tip over his own king. When I finished, he leaned back and smiled. A real one, not the version he used in public. Then he said, "I was starting to wonder when you'd get there." He said it warmly. That was the ugliest part. Almost generous, like congratulating a difficult child for finally eating vegetables. He had been waiting for me to fold, and now that I had, he felt uncomplicated pleasure. He buzzed his assistant. Within the hour, the termination orders were on his desk. 9 names, all current staff, effective the closure date. Then he had the building closure order brought in separately, a single page directing that the Alderton Municipal Conservatory be closed to public access effective 8 a.m. the next morning, pending facility transfer and remediation. He signed it with his own pen, the same way he had signed Mikhail's termination order on that Tuesday morning without even looking up. I watched him sign every page, kept my face exactly where it needed to be. He handed me copies. I stood, shook his hand, and left. I walked across the street into the parking structure, sat in my car for 4 minutes, then called Harold Greaves and said, "He signed everything." Harold said, "When's the zoning meeting?" I said Thursday. He said, "I'll have the certified copies by Wednesday noon." I said good. Then I drove back to the conservatory, walked through the tropical wing one last time, and stopped under the old fig tree in the atrium. I put my hand on the bark for a second. 100 years of it, still warm from the heat that remained. Then I went home and slept. Under all the operational logic, there was something else. And I'll say it because I said at the beginning that feelings are information, and this one belongs in the record. I didn't just want him stopped. I wanted him informed. I wanted him to know it was me. I wanted the man who had called me an overgrown librarian, who had dismissed me, talked down to me, and written me off like background clutter, to understand that I had been the one holding the mechanism the entire time. While he was ordering Belgian glass and calling Mikhail a transition challenge, I was finishing the work. I wanted that knowledge to be the last clean thought he had before the ground dropped. That's not legal strategy. That's older than legal strategy, and I'm not sorry for it. Getting the certified copies took most of Monday and every bit of patience I had left. Municipal process is slow, even when it works, and when you need it to move, you learn how much government depends on tired people deciding to do one extra thing because you asked without wasting their time. Ruth pushed the archive seal through faster than she had to. A deputy clerk named Menendez found the transfer ledger proving the deed had never left official custody, except for conservation review in 1978. Harold dictated the affidavit himself because, according to him, younger attorneys had become too dependent on templates and no longer knew how to write a sentence that could survive a hostile judge. By Tuesday afternoon, I had the deed, the affidavit, the chain of custody references, and a separate folder with Vane's signed termination orders and closure order. I spread them across my dining table in 4 neat stacks and practiced the order in which they needed to appear. Not what I would say. That part was simple. The order in which paper changes a room. Deed first, then staffing, then closure, then consequence. Put the evidence in the wrong order and people hear an argument. Put it in the right order and they hear inevitability. People picture traps as active things. Springs, levers, mechanical drama. Most traps are quieter than that. Most traps are just a correct understanding of somebody's habits, enough to know exactly which corner they'll cut the minute you give them room. By Wednesday night, I was no longer worried about the law. I was only worried about sequencing. The law was a wall. My job was to make sure Curtis Vane hit it at speed. The trap was set. He built most of it himself. All I did was hand him the hammer. The Alderton City Council Zoning Committee meets on the third Thursday of every month in a room that looked last updated during the Carter administration and sounded like a small church. Wood paneling on 3 walls, a raised dais for 7 committee members, public seating that folded down from the floor like pews, which felt appropriate given how much faith people usually have to bring into that room. The meeting was televised on the Municipal Access Channel. It always is. Under normal circumstances, the audience for Municipal Access Television is basically nobody. Retirees, insomniacs, people who fall asleep with the remote on their chest. That Thursday, it was somewhat larger. Harold had made a few calls. I never asked him to. I also never asked him not to. Men his age, when they're good at what they do, understand timing better than most younger people understand strategy. I got there early, signed the public comment card, sat in the 3rd row, opened my notebook, waited. Vane's presentation was second on the agenda, right after a variance request about fence height on Millbrook Avenue, which took 11 minutes longer than it should have because one committee member had passionate feelings about cedar versus composite. During those 11 minutes, I watched Vane's team set up. There were 3 of them. Vane, one architect and a communications consultant whose entire job seemed to be standing at a slight angle that suggested momentum. They had a projected rendering, a bound presentation booklet with the Vane Development Group logo on the cover. In other words, everything people bring when they're sure the room already belongs to them. Vane kept his jacket on, which he usually didn't. He had dressed for the occasion. He looked relaxed in the way people look when they think the dirty part of the transaction is over and all that's left is applause. He glanced across the room once. His eyes passed over me the way they always did. Register, dismiss, move on. I had a manila folder in my lap. Inside it was a certified copy of the 1924 deed with the raised archive seal, a notarized affidavit from Harold establishing chain of custody, and a clean set of photocopies of the termination and closure orders Vane had signed. I had read every one of those documents 3 times on the drive over. Not because I needed to, because when the stakes are real and you only get one clean approach, you don't improvise your footing. Vane's presentation ran 14 minutes. The rendering showed a glass private club where the greenhouse stood now. Clean lines, modern materials, the kind of building designed to tell everybody outside it that the people inside had already won. He called it a landmark revitalization of an underutilized municipal asset. He said community benefit twice. He talked about jobs, tax revenue, and the city's ability to attract high net worth residents. He said the word vision 4 times. The committee asked questions, mostly the kind of questions committees ask after they've already decided yes. Soft, clarifying, just enough to create the appearance that process happened. They weren't interrogating the project, they were helping it pass through the shape of procedure. 2 members cared about the tax projections. 1 asked about parking. Nobody asked about the 1924 deed. Of course they didn't. Nobody in that room knew it existed. When the chair asked whether any member of the public wanted to comment, I raised my hand. It didn't feel like triumph. Not yet. Triumph comes later, if it comes at all. What I felt walking down the center aisle with that folder under my arm was closer to standing at the top of a long staircase and understanding exactly what gravity is about to do. I set the folder on the podium, adjusted the microphone, said my name, my title, and that I had worked 11 years at the Alderton Municipal Conservatory. I said it flat, like reading a caption. Then I said I wasn't there to comment on the rendering or tax projections or parking. I said I was there to introduce a document with direct bearing on the committee's jurisdiction. I took out the certified copy of the 1924 deed, held it up for a second, set it down, and began reading Section 7, Paragraph C. I read the whole thing, every line, in the original language, formal, old-fashioned, and absolutely clear. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when people realize the facts in front of them belong to a different situation than the one they thought they were sitting in. When I finished, I set the deed aside and took out the termination orders. I said 9 employees of the Alderton Municipal Conservatory had been terminated, effective the facility closure date, by written order bearing Mr. Vane's signature. I said I had signed copies with me. I said the conservatory had been closed to public access by written order bearing Mr. Vane's signature, effective 8 a.m. on the morning of November 19th. I said I had that order too. I said the termination of city-contracted staff and the closure of the facility to public access constituted, under Section 7, Paragraph C of the 1924 Alderton Deed, a triggering event for automatic reversion of the property to the City of Alderton in fee simple absolute. I said the reversion was self-executing, no cure period, no notice requirement, no grace period, no court needed to make it happen. I said the reversion had already occurred by operation of law at 8:01 a.m. on November 19th, 4 days earlier. I said the property was already the city's. I said Mr. Vane's $25 million transaction had already been voided by the terms of the original instrument of conveyance, terms that had never been repealed, amended, or superseded because nobody in the city's later paperwork had ever addressed them. Nobody had looked. I said I had 3 certified copies of all relevant documents for the committee record and would leave them with the clerk. Then I said thank you, gathered the folder, and sat down. There was no shouting, no uproar, just about 4 seconds of silence with a very particular feel to it. The feel of a room full of people all changing direction at once. Then the chair said slowly, "Counsel, does the city's legal office have access to the original deed?" Patricia Solis, the city attorney, had been sitting at the end of the dais, looking like she expected a routine evening. She checked her notes, looked at me, then at the chair, and said she would need to review the document and verify the terms. Vane's communications consultant leaned in and whispered something. His architect looked at his phone and quietly closed the presentation booklet. Vane sat very still. That was new. He had been in constant motion for weeks. Phone, pen, glance, dismissal. But now he just sat there. I could actually see him thinking, and I hadn't seen him do that before. The chair called a 15-minute recess. Vane found me in the hallway outside the chamber. I'll record that part exactly, because it was the only moment in the whole sequence I hadn't fully planned, and it was probably the most important one. He came at me fast, with 2 lawyers a step behind him, stopped about 4 feet away, and looked at me with the face of a man who had just discovered the floor under him was not the floor he thought it was. Not anger, not yet. Something rougher. Disorientation. The very specific look of somebody who has never before run into a problem he couldn't spend or litigate his way around. He said, "You knew. When you came to my office, you already knew." I said, "Yes." He said, "The keys, the lists, you—" Then he stopped, looked at me. "You made me sign it." I told him I had handed him paperwork. He had made his own decisions about what to sign and when. He stared at me. One lawyer was already on his phone. The other was halfway through a legal theory he hadn't finished forming. The architect had gone back inside. The communications consultant had vanished, which is exactly what communications consultants do when the communications are ruined. Then Vane said, very quietly, "I called you an overgrown librarian." There was no apology in it. He wasn't built for that. It sounded more like he had finally understood the category of mistake he had made. I said I remembered. That was it. He turned and walked toward the exit while his lawyers kept talking at him, and he didn't seem to hear a word of it. I wrote it down. That was the last time I ever spoke to Curtis Vane. The committee reconvened. During the recess, Patricia Solis had reached Harold Greaves by phone. Harold had been expecting her call. Within the hour, the city's position was settled. The deed was authentic. The reversion clause was valid. The property had already reverted. The committee's jurisdiction over the rezoning application was moot because the applicant no longer owned the property he was asking to rezone. During the recess, the room changed faster than I expected. Staffers who had been half listening a minute earlier were suddenly moving with purpose. Phones came out. The clerk started making copies. One committee aide went from bored to pale in maybe 10 seconds. which I respected because at least it meant somebody in the building understood what had just happened. Even the public seating felt different when we went back in, like the air pressure had shifted. Before that moment, Vane had been the man bringing the future into the room. After it, he was just a man waiting to hear whether the past still had teeth. It did. The chair thanked Mr. Vane's team for their presentation. He did it in that steady, bureaucratic tone public officials use after enough years of delivering news other people will remember forever. Then he said the committee would enter the reversion into the record and refer the matter to the city attorney's office for formal documentation of title transfer. That was the administrative shooting. Right there. A sentence and a half, spoken flatly in a wood-paneled room on municipal television. $25 million reduced to a committee line item. That was the whole body of it. Years of maneuvering, presentations, phone calls, dinners, signatures, all flattened into municipal language that would later sit in a binder on a shelf. 3 days later, city marshals showed up at the conservatory gates with bolt cutters and a court order. The court order wasn't legally necessary. The reversion had already happened, but the city legal department prefers documented process over elegant theory when actual locks are involved, which I respect. They cut Vane's corporate locks off the main gate in about 45 seconds. I watched from a bench across the street. The gates were original, wrought iron from the 1920s. Alderton City seal worked into the center of each panel. They swung open the same way they always had. Same hinges, same arc. Bernard was the first one through. I had called him the night before and told him to come in the morning. He arrived at 6:15, exactly when he always arrived, because he still didn't own an alarm clock and still didn't need one. Work gloves in his back pocket, coffee in his hand. He walked through those gates the way he had for 31 years, with no performance and no pause, just the way a man walks into a place that belongs to him. He didn't look around to see who was watching, didn't stop to honor the moment. He just went inside to do his job. I didn't go in that morning. I sat on the bench and watched Bernard go in. Then Elena. Then the others, one by one, in the same order they had always arrived, like the past few weeks had been a delay instead of an attempted demolition. Nobody made a show of it. Nobody needed to. The strongest thing about that morning was how ordinary they let it be. I sat there until the building was full again. Then I went home. None of it felt satisfying the way people imagine justice feels. It wasn't warm. There was no glowing moment where I stood under the Victorian glass and felt the story close around me. What I felt was closer to finishing a long calculation, checking the answer, and finding it correct. Quiet confirmation. The work had been done properly. The result held. That was enough. Mikhail came back on Monday. He walked past the fig tree and patted the trunk on his way by, like he always had, and like I had always pretended not to notice because it was private. He went into the tropical wing and started his rounds. The building was back at the temperature it should have been. The orchids that survived the heating cuts were still alive because Elena had moved them to the warmer section, covered them, and come in nights and weekends when she wasn't supposed to be there and definitely wasn't being paid. She did it because the alternative was to stand there and watch them die. That was what all of this was actually about. Not the 25 million, not the reversion clause, not the elegance of a self-executing legal mechanism drafted in 1924. Those were just the tools. What mattered was the right of a 72-year-old man to walk past a tree he had known for 3 decades and touch it on his way to work. The right of 9 people to show up somewhere that mattered and do work that mattered without being told by a man with a pen and a contempt habit that their years amounted to nothing. That was the wound. The document was just how I dressed it. Vane sued within the week. I was deposed in the 4th month. I sat in a conference room across from one of his attorneys for 6 hours and answered every question cleanly and accurately. At the end, the attorney looked at his notes, looked at me, and said, "You planned all of this from the beginning, didn't you?" He meant it as an accusation. I said the documents had been publicly available in the city archive for 102 years. Anybody could have found them. I just found them first. He wrote something on his pad. I didn't ask what. The city took possession with the strange caution institutions adopt after they almost make a catastrophic mistake and would prefer not to discuss it. Inventory forms, temporary signs, meetings where serious people said things like transition, stabilization, and heritage continuity, as if language itself might reduce liability. Patricia Solis came to the conservatory 2 days after the marshals cut the locks. We walked the grounds for 40 minutes. She looked at the gates, the boiler access, the public paths, the signage, the staff entrances. She was not there to admire anything. She was there to identify points where the city could be embarrassed again if it stayed stupid. She asked almost no rhetorical questions, which I appreciated. Competence doesn't pretend to discover facts already available. She wanted practical exposure points, staffing continuity, insurance reinstatement, HVAC restoration, public access timing. We went through each one while Bernard swept wet leaves from the west entrance and pretended not to listen. Vane's lawsuit named half the municipal government, Harold, and eventually me in an amended filing that accused me of fraudulent concealment, tortious interference, and several other things clearly drafted by expensive people billing by the hour. The allegations were dramatic. Discovery was not. Boxes moved, affidavits got exchanged, calendars shifted, billing meters spun. Every threatening sentence got translated into paperwork and stripped of its posture. Men in dark suits asked whether I had deliberately withheld knowledge of the reversion clause when I met with Vane in his office. I said I had not been under any legal obligation to educate him about the governing history of land he claimed to own. Harold objected twice. Once on substance, once, with visible pleasure, on stupidity. My deposition took place in a conference room with a fake ficus in one corner and bad coffee on a side credenza, which felt a little on the nose but not inaccurate. Vane wasn't there for the first 4 hours. His lead attorney did the questioning in that polished tone lawyers use when they want the court reporter to hear reasonableness instead of hostility. He walked me through dates, memos, archive visits, staffing rosters, environmental logs. I answered all of it. The truth has one big advantage under oath. It doesn't ask much of your memory. It just asks you to sit there long enough for the other person to get tired of hearing it. Sometime after lunch, Vane came in quietly and sat against the back wall. When I finally looked at him, he had the expression of a man learning that litigation cannot reverse embarrassment. It can only send invoices after it. After the deposition, the whole thing settled into that dead administrative middle where lawsuits go to waste time and money. Motions, extensions, revised calendars, new deadlines replacing old ones. The building, meanwhile, kept doing what buildings do when people stop using them as weapons. Pipes had to be bled. Soil had to be turned. School groups started coming through again in careful little lines. Tour volunteers came back. A piano recital got scheduled in the East Gallery for the first time since the closure notice. That's what Vane never really understood. He thought the fight was about ownership because ownership was the only language he trusted. It wasn't. The real fight was about function, about whether the place would keep being itself after he touched it. The case was dismissed with prejudice in the spring. I still work there. That's probably the right ending. Not because it's tidy, but because it's true. Institutional preservation isn't glamorous. You just show up again the next morning, no matter what happened the day before. The building still has humidity problems. Grant applications are still due in February. The fig tree is still in the center atrium and will probably still be there after everyone in this story is gone, because fig trees are patient in a way people usually aren't. Mikhail turned 73 in February. We had cake in the break room with the right number of candles, which is what we always do on birthdays there. Vane's arrival interrupted that tradition for part of a season. Then we went right back to it as if it hadn't been interrupted at all, because sometimes the strongest form of institutional memory is refusing to officially acknowledge the interruption. I didn't give a speech. There was nothing to say the room didn't already know. I handed Mikhail his slice. He said thank you, and I went back to my office. Outside the window, the grounds were starting to wake up from winter, the way they always do, with no explanation and no self-congratulation. That is the discipline of living things. They don't explain themselves, they just keep going. They don't hold committee meetings about resilience. They don't narrate their recovery, they just resume function. I find that useful. He thought he was clearing land. He had no idea he was putting the mechanism in my hand. And once I had it, the only thing I needed from him was that he keep being exactly who he was. He did. They always do. That's the part they never understand. The arrogance isn't incidental to how they lose. It's how they get there.